If you take a small snowball, pack it tightly in your bare hands, and start rolling it down a very long snow-covered hill, something mathematically extraordinary begins to happen. It gathers a little more snow with that first rotation, and then a little more with the next. The growth is incredibly slow at first, almost invisible to the naked eye. But by the time that snowball reaches the bottom of the slope, it has transformed into a massive, unstoppable force. That is the fundamental power of compounding. However, the greatest mistake ordinary, hardworking people make is looking at that word compounding and assuming it only applies to money sitting in a brokerage account on Wall Street. For decades, the financial industry has treated compounding as if it were a proprietary secret, a dry mathematical formula used exclusively by bankers to calculate interest, or a luxury reserved solely for billionaires and elite investors. This creates a deeply tragic misconception. The average person hears the word compounding and immediately tunes out. They look at their modest paycheck, they look at their mounting bills, and they assume that because they do not have $50,000 to invest right now, this concept simply does not apply to them. They believe it is a game they are not wealthy enough to play. The truth I have observed over 8 decades of participating in the economy is completely different. Compounding is not just a financial trick. It is a universal law of nature. It governs absolutely every single aspect of human existence. For the ordinary person navigating the challenges of modern life, understanding how to align your daily actions with this force is the single greatest separator between a life of constant, exhausting struggle and a life of deep, unshakable autonomy. It is the invisible current beneath everything you do. So what does compounding actually mean for someone who is just trying to pay their mortgage and raise a family? At its core, compounding is simply the process where the results of your past actions become the foundation for your future actions. You do something small today, and it yields a tiny result. Tomorrow, you do not start from zero. You start from that tiny result, and you build upon it. The interest earns interest. The knowledge connects to new knowledge. The good decision makes the next good decision slightly easier to execute. But we must understand that compounding is entirely blind. It is a mathematical mechanism, not a moral one, which means it is a deeply unforgiving double-edged sword. It does not care if you are pushing the snowball toward a better life or if the snowball is rolling backward directly over you. When you make poor choices, or when you simply surrender to the chaotic drift of modern life, you trigger the dark side of this equation. Bad decisions compound downward into ruin just as powerfully and often much faster than good choices compound upward into freedom. If you spend a little more than you earn, if you chronically neglect your physical health, or if you consistently break your promises, you do not instantly ruin your life on the first day. The cost seems negligible at first, but day by day, those tiny deficits pile up, feeding on each other. A decade later, you wake up feeling completely trapped, exhausted, and wondering how your life became so incredibly difficult. You are experiencing the heavy, crushing weight of negative compounding. Conversely, when you harness this law in a positive direction, it is the closest thing to actual magic that exists in the human experience. You do not need a massive inheritance to activate it. You do not need a genius-level IQ, and you do not need to invent a groundbreaking new technology. You simply need to understand the length of the hill. The most crucial component of the snowball metaphor is not how big the snowball is when you start. It is how long the hill is and whether the snow is sticky enough to hold together. In life, the length of the hill is time. The stickiness of the snow is your consistency. If you can maintain your discipline over a very long timeline, allowing the tiny, seemingly insignificant daily improvements to stack on top of one another, the math will eventually do the heavy lifting for you. The early years will test your patience. You will push the snowball, and it will look like absolutely nothing is happening. This is the exact moment where the vast majority of people quit. They look for a shortcut. They try to find a steeper hill, or they try to build a massive snowball overnight, usually by taking foolish risks. But if you simply keep pushing, refusing to interrupt the compounding process unnecessarily, the momentum will eventually shift. The invisible will become highly visible. Today, we are going to explore how this quiet, unstoppable force shapes your reality. We will step completely outside the narrow confines of the stock market and look at the 5 distinct lanes of your life where compounding is happening right now, whether you realize it or not. We will examine how it alters your financial reality, how it dictates your earning power, how it builds your reputation, how it governs your physical energy, and ultimately, how it architects the very core of your identity. This is not a theoretical lecture about getting rich quick. It is a highly practical framework for ordinary people who want to reclaim control of their future. We are going to look at the exact mechanics of how small, boring, everyday choices accumulate into a life of profound security. Once you see the world through the lens of compounding, you will never look at a single day the same way again. Let us begin by examining the most obvious and immediate lane where this force operates and how an ordinary worker can use it to buy something far more valuable than luxury goods. Let us look at your money. We start with the first and most visible lane of compounding, your money. However, we are not going to talk about using compound interest to buy a massive yacht, a private island, or a fleet of exotic cars. That kind of conversation is completely disconnected from the reality of the ordinary worker. When you are taking home a modest paycheck, navigating the rising costs of groceries, and trying to keep the lights on, the idea of saving $50 or $100 a month can feel entirely pointless. You look at a spreadsheet, you calculate a standard rate of return, and you realize that your $50 a month is not going to make you a millionaire anytime soon. The math feels profoundly boring, incredibly slow, and deeply uninspiring. But this is because we have been taught to measure financial compounding by the wrong metric. For the ordinary person, the true magic of compound interest is not about buying luxury goods 3 decades from now. The true magic is that it buys you a margin of safety today. Think about what life feels like when you have absolutely zero savings. You are operating on the extreme edge of your financial capabilities. You are living paycheck to paycheck, which means you require the entire world to function perfectly just for you to survive. But the world is never perfect. When you live without a margin of safety, a broken water heater, a flat tire, or an unexpected medical bill is not just an inconvenience, it is a full-blown terrifying crisis. It ruins your week, it strains your marriage, and it keeps you staring at the ceiling at 2 in the morning, wondering how you are going to survive the month. You are living your entire life playing defense, constantly bracing for the next inevitable blow. Now imagine what happens when you start allowing even a tiny amount of money to quietly compound in the background. You save a little bit of your paycheck, you put it in a boring, reliable index fund or a high-yield savings account, and you simply leave it alone. At first it is just a few $100s, then it becomes a few thousand. Slowly, steadily, the interest earns interest. The snowball begins to pack itself together. As that financial margin grows, something profound happens to your psychology. The heavy, suffocating panic that used to accompany unexpected expenses begins to evaporate. When the car transmission inevitably fails, you do not have a panic attack. You are certainly not thrilled about it, but you simply write a check from your cash reserves, get the car fixed, and go right back to your life. Your emotional baseline remains entirely undisturbed. Financial compounding has not made you obscenely wealthy, but it has purchased something infinitely more valuable. It has bought you breathing room. It has insulated your peace of mind from the chaotic friction of the modern world. To truly understand the power of this margin of safety, we must look at what happens when you get the math backward. If positive compounding is the quiet builder of freedom, negative compounding is the aggressive architect of modern slavery. The most common and devastating form of negative compounding is high-interest consumer debt, specifically the credit card. Millions of honest, hard-working people fall into the trap of financing their lifestyle. They want a new television, a nice vacation, or a wardrobe they cannot quite afford today, so they put it on a credit card charging 20% interest. They assume they will just pay it off eventually, but they fail to respect the ruthless, mechanical nature of the snowball rolling in the wrong direction. When you carry a balance at a high interest rate, the compounding works relentlessly against you. The bank calculates interest on your original purchase, and the next month they charge you interest on the interest. The debt begins to grow faster than you can reasonably pay it down. You are suddenly trapped on a treadmill that is constantly speeding up. But the tragedy of negative compounding is not just the mathematical loss of money. The tragedy is the theft of your future labor. When you buy a television on a high-interest credit card, you are making a binding mathematical agreement that your future self will have to wake up early on a cold Tuesday morning, drive to a job you might not even like, and work for 3 hours simply to pay the interest on a piece of plastic that is already obsolete. Your future time has been confiscated by a bank. This negative compounding drains your energy and destroys your options. You cannot quit a toxic job because you have massive monthly payments to make. You cannot take a calculated risk on a new career because you are entirely chained to your current paycheck. You are no longer the owner of your life. You have become a tenant, renting your existence from your creditors. The stress of this reality is what causes so many people to feel deeply, chronically exhausted. The transition from a life of financial defense to a life of financial offense is entirely dependent on which side of the compounding equation you choose to stand on. You have to aggressively attack and eliminate the negative compounding of consumer debt, treating it like a fire in your own home, And simultaneously, you must start the quiet, unglamorous process of letting positive compounding build your margin of safety. When your money begins to work for you, generating a return while you are sleeping, while you are playing with your kids, or while you are simply sitting on the porch, your relationship with the world changes. You realize that you do not need to hit a lottery jackpot to feel secure. You just need a strong foundation. You stop looking for ways to look rich to your neighbors, and you start focusing on being genuinely free. However, building a financial margin of safety is only the first lane of compounding. While money provides the physical buffer against the world's shocks, it is not the engine that ultimately drives your life forward. The money you save is a byproduct of the value you create. To truly accelerate your progress and escape the stagnation of an ordinary job, you have to apply the exact same mathematical law to the asset that actually produces your income. You have to learn how to compound your own capability. This brings us to the second and arguably the most important lane of your life, the slow, unstoppable compounding of your personal skill and earning power. When we talk about investing, the natural assumption is that we are talking about allocating cash into stocks, bonds, or real estate. But for the vast majority of ordinary, hardworking people, the absolute best investment you will ever make in your entire life is the investment in your own human capital. Your earning power is the foundational engine of your financial life. Every dollar you will ever save, invest, or use to build your margin of safety must first be generated by your ability to provide value to the marketplace. And just like money in a bank account, your ability to provide value is governed entirely by the mathematical law of compounding. There is a widespread misconception that increasing your earning power requires taking on massive amounts of student loan debt, going back to school for an expensive advanced degree, or completely uprooting your career to start over in a new industry. The modern education system heavily promotes this idea, suggesting that your value is determined by the piece of paper hanging on your wall. But out in the real world, the marketplace is incredibly practical. It simply wants to know if you can solve a problem, and if you can solve it better, faster, or more reliably than the person sitting next to you. You do not need a fancy credential to increase your value. You simply need to adopt a philosophy of going to bed every single night, just a little bit smarter and a little bit more capable than you were when you woke up that morning. Think of your mind as a toolbox. When you first enter the workforce, you are handed a very basic empty toolbox. You learn a few simple tasks, you figure out how to operate within your company, and you get paid a modest wage for that basic utility. At this stage, you are easily replaceable because there are millions of other people with the exact same empty toolbox. But imagine if you decided to spend just 30 minutes a day adding one new small tool to that box. You read a chapter of a book about human psychology. You spend an hour on the weekend learning a new feature of the software your company uses. You ask a senior coworker to explain how the supply chain actually works. In the short term, this daily effort feels completely invisible. You read a book on a Tuesday evening, and you do not wake up on Wednesday morning with a higher salary. The snowball is barely moving. But human knowledge does not just add up, it multiplies. It compounds exactly like interest. A seemingly random fact you learned today quietly sits in your brain waiting. 2 years from now, your company faces a complex problem. Suddenly, that random fact connects with a piece of software you learned last month, and you see a solution that nobody else in the room can see. Your mental models begin to overlap and reinforce one another. Over a 10-year horizon, the ordinary worker who consistently compounds their skills undergoes a radical transformation. You transition from being a worker who simply follows instructions to a highly leveraged professional who dictates outcomes. You become utterly indispensable. When you become the person who holds the institutional knowledge, who understands how the different pieces of the business connect, and who can reliably solve the expensive problems, you no longer have to beg for a 3% annual raise. You begin to dictate your own worth in the marketplace because your human capital has compounded into a rare and highly valuable asset. To understand the absolute necessity of this process, we must look at the terrifying reality of negative compounding in the workplace. What happens if you do absolutely nothing? Millions of people fall into the comfortable trap of the stagnant worker. They learn the basic requirements of their job in the first 6 months, and then they completely turn off their brain. They coast, they clock in, they do the bare minimum required to not get fired, and they clock out. They believe they are cleverly preserving their energy. But the economy is not static. It is constantly evolving. Technology improves, industries shift, and the baseline requirements for ordinary jobs are constantly being elevated. If you are standing completely still, you are mathematically moving backward. Your skills are actively depreciating. The stagnant worker is experiencing the negative compounding of obsolescence. Every year that passes, their empty toolbox becomes less and less relevant to the modern world. When an economic recession eventually hits, or when a company is forced to downsize, the management does not draw names out of a hat. They look at who provides irreplaceable value and who is merely occupying a chair. The worker who allowed their skills to stagnate for a decade is always the first one to be let go. And the true tragedy strikes when they try to re-enter the job market only to discover that the skills they relied on for 10 years are no longer valued by anyone. They are forced to start over at the bottom, accepting a lower wage simply because they refuse to push the snowball of their own capability. Compounding your skill is the ultimate defense against becoming irrelevant. It is the only reliable way to ensure that inflation and economic shifts do not permanently destroy your standard of living. When you dedicate yourself to lifelong incremental learning, you are building a moat around your career. You are ensuring that no matter what happens to the broader economy, you will always possess the leverage to demand a fair wage for your time. And as your capability grows, you will inevitably interact with more people, manage larger projects, and take on heavier responsibilities. Your skills will get you into the room, but your skills alone will not keep you there. As you rise, the mechanics of your success shift from what you know to how you are perceived by others. You step into a realm where human relationships govern the flow of capital and opportunity. To ensure your compounded skills actually translate into a better life, you must master the most fragile and valuable lane of compounding in the human experience. We must talk about the quiet, immense power of your reputation. If you watch how business is actually conducted at the highest levels, you will quickly realize that the most valuable currency in the world is not the United States dollar. The dollar is simply a medium of exchange, the true underlying currency that dictates how far you can go, what doors will open for you, and how easily you can navigate the modern economy is a seamless web of deserved trust. Trust is the invisible infrastructure of a successful life. And just like money and skill, trust is entirely governed by the law of compounding. However, the snowball of a good reputation is the slowest, heaviest snowball you will ever have to push. You cannot build a lifelong reputation in a weekend workshop, and you cannot buy it with a clever marketing campaign. Deserved trust is compounded through thousands of tiny, seemingly mundane daily interactions where you prove to the world that you are exactly who you say you are. It happens in the quiet moments. You show up exactly when you promised you would arrive. You deliver the work you committed to, even when it requires staying an extra hour. When a project goes terribly wrong, you stand up, look your manager in the eye, and take absolute ownership of your mistake instead of desperately pointing fingers at your coworkers. When you are in a position to take unfair credit for someone else's idea, you refuse, and you publicly praise the person who actually did the work. For a very long time, it feels like nobody is noticing this behavior. You act with complete integrity, and the world does not immediately hand you a massive reward. You watch other people cut corners, take shortcuts, and seemingly get ahead faster. It can be incredibly frustrating. But the compounding of trust is happening quietly below the surface. Every time you behave honorably, you deposit a small coin into your reputational bank account. Eventually, that account reaches a critical mass, and your reputation begins to act like a powerful magnet. This is when you start collecting the massive dividends of trust. When a company has a highly lucrative unlisted job opening, the hiring manager does not want to read 500 resumes from strangers. They want to ask someone they trust for a recommendation. If your name comes up, you completely bypass the entire line. When you want to start a business and need a loan, a banker who knows your impeccable character will fight to get you the capital. When you inevitably make an honest mistake, instead of being fired, you are given the benefit of the doubt. The world brings opportunities directly to your doorstep because people know that partnering with you is a safe, predictable, and profitable bet. A high-trust life operates with incredible speed and almost zero friction. But the double-edged sword of compounding is never more brutal than it is in the realm of reputation. While a good reputation compounds slowly and builds a fortress around your life, a bad reputation compounds with terrifying accelerating speed, and it will systematically dismantle every advantage you possess. Consider what happens when you introduce negative compounding into your relationships. You tell a small lie to cover up a missed deadline. You overpromise and underdeliver to a client to get a quick commission. You speak poorly about a coworker behind their back. You think you got away with it because no one immediately confronted you. But people have a remarkable biological instinct for detecting dishonesty. The invisible ledger is updated. The negative snowball starts rolling. The next time a major project is assigned, you are quietly left off the email chain. When a promotion is available, management chooses the less experienced but more reliable candidate. People stop bringing you opportunities. But worse than that, the friction of your life increases exponentially. When people do not trust you, every single interaction becomes an exhausting, heavy burden. People demand everything in writing. They double-check your math. They require lawyers, contracts, and constant oversight just to interact with you. A low-trust life is a life of permanent, exhausting defense. You are isolated, and the world actively works to protect itself from you. The compounding effect of a bad reputation ensures that every step forward requires 10 times the effort, simply because you have to drag the dead weight of your past deceit along with you. And here is the most sobering, unforgiving reality about the third lane of compounding. It's extreme fragility. Money can be lost in a bad investment and earned back the following year. A skill can grow rusty and be relearned with a month of intense study. But trust operates on a completely different physical law. It takes 20 solid years of perfect, unbroken behavior to build a phenomenal reputation. And it takes exactly 5 minutes of foolishness to completely destroy it. One severe breach of integrity, one major lie, one stolen client, one moment of massive ethical compromise does not just set your snowball back a few feet. It instantly shatters the snowball into a million pieces. The compounding clock is violently reset to zero, and the market is incredibly reluctant to ever let you start pushing that particular snowball up the hill again. If you want to build a life of enduring security, you must guard your reputation with an almost irrational intensity. You must view your integrity not just as a moral obligation, but as your most valuable financial asset. When you combine a financial margin of safety with a compounding skill set, and you wrap it all in an unshakable reputation for honesty, you have built an architecture that is virtually bulletproof against the ordinary shocks of the economy. However, there is one final internal variable that can still tear this entire structure down. You can have the money, the skills, and the trust of your community, but if the machine operating those assets is fundamentally broken, the math will still fail. We must turn our attention away from the outside world and look deeply inward. We must examine the daily physical routines that govern your energy, your mood, and your longevity. We have to look at the fourth lane of compounding, the invisible heavy chains of your daily habits. We have spent considerable time examining the external elements of your life. We have looked at how your money, your skills, and your reputation all grow through the mathematical law of compounding. But all of those external assets are ultimately managed by a single piece of biological machinery. You can possess a comfortable financial margin of safety, a highly valuable skill set, and the absolute trust of your community. But if the internal machine operating those assets is fundamentally broken down, the math will still fail. This brings us to the fourth lane of your life, which is the compounding of your physical and emotional routines. We must look at the invisible heavy chains of your daily habits. There is a profound observation about human behavior that has always guided my thinking on this subject. It is the simple reality that the chains of our daily habits are usually too light to be felt, right up until the exact moment they become too heavy to be broken. A habit is essentially a behavior that has been placed on autopilot. And just like the financial interest in a bank account, your daily physical and emotional routines are compounding every single day, completely blind to whether they are helping you or destroying you. Let us first examine the biological reality of negative compounding. In the modern world, millions of hardworking people take out silent, high-interest loans against their own biology. Because the workday is incredibly demanding and the stress of paying bills is ever present, we often sacrifice our foundational health just to keep up. We skip sleep to watch one more hour of television. We eat fast, heavily processed food because we are too exhausted to cook. We sit in a chair for 10 hours straight, entirely neglecting the simple act of moving our bodies. When you are 25 or 30 years old, you can get away with this. The human body is remarkably resilient in its youth. You can sleep for 4 hours, eat a terrible diet, and still show up to the office the next day with enough energy to perform your job. Because there is no immediate catastrophic penalty for these actions, you naturally assume that the behavior is free, but biology does not offer free passes. It only offers delayed invoices. You are actively pushing a snowball of physiological debt down a very long hill. By the time you reach your late 40s or 50s, that negative compounding results in a devastating reality. The chronic lack of sleep, the poor nutrition, and the sedentary lifestyle accumulate into chronic illness, severe lethargy, and absolute physical burnout. Your joints ache, your blood pressure skyrockets, and your cognitive sharpness begins to fade. The money you spent your entire life saving must now be handed over to hospitals and pharmacies just to keep you functioning. You sacrifice the machine to acquire the assets, only to realize that the assets are completely worthless if the machine cannot enjoy them. And this negative compounding is not limited to your physical body. It applies just as ruthlessly to your emotional habits. Consider the habit of reacting to the world with immediate anger or frustration. Many people develop a daily routine of losing their temper in traffic, snapping at their coworkers over minor inconveniences, or complaining endlessly about the state of the economy. Every time you indulge in that reactive anger, you are carving a neurological pathway in your brain. You are training your nervous system to view the entire world as a permanent threat. Over a decade, this emotional habit compounds into a highly toxic personality. You become permanently cynical. People begin to actively avoid you. Your relationships slowly wither away, and your home becomes a place of quiet tension rather than a sanctuary of rest. You did not decide to become a miserable person overnight. You simply allowed the small daily habit of negative reaction to compound until the chain was too heavy to break. Now look at what happens when you reverse this process and harness the law of compounding to protect your biological and emotional machinery. The actions required to build immense physical stamina and unshakable emotional calm are incredibly simple. They do not require an expensive gym membership, a personal chef, or a complex array of dietary supplements. They simply require consistency. It begins with fiercely protecting your sleep. When you view a full 8 hours of rest not as a luxury but as the ultimate biological protector of your judgment, your entire life changes. Sleep is the daily deposit you make into your cognitive savings account. It flushes the toxins from your brain, repairs your cellular tissue, and resets your emotional baseline. When you consistently prioritize your rest, you wake up with a quiet, grounded energy that allows you to navigate the friction of the workday without losing your temper. You stop borrowing from tomorrow just to survive today. Alongside sleep, there is the simple compounding power of daily movement. You do not need to run marathons to build a resilient body. The ordinary act of taking a brisk 30-minute walk every single day yields mathematical miracles over a long timeline. It keeps your cardiovascular system strong, clears the anxiety from your mind, and maintains the physical mobility you will desperately want when you reach your later years. When you combine this daily movement with the habit of eating genuine unprocessed food, you are building a physical fortress. The exact same positive compounding applies to your emotional habits. You can actively practice the habit of restraint. When a coworker sends a frustrating email, or when a driver cuts you off in traffic, you do not have to react instantly. You can build the habit of taking a single deep breath and inserting a 3-second pause between the event and your response. In that tiny pause, you reclaim your autonomy. You choose to respond with calm logic rather than primitive anger. At first, this restraint requires an immense amount of willpower. But as you practice it day after day, it compounds. It becomes your default operating system. You develop a reputation as the person who never panics, the person who remains remarkably steady when everyone else is losing their minds. This emotional moat protects your career, deepens your marriage, and preserves your daily peace of mind. When you string together years of adequate sleep, simple physical movement, and emotional restraint, you build a machine that is capable of carrying the heavy loads of life with grace. You possess the energy to actually enjoy the financial margin you have built and the trust you have earned. But all of these lanes, your money, your skills, your reputation, and your habits ultimately converge into one final, overarching destination. Every single choice you make is quietly assembling a much larger structure. We must now look at the fifth and final lane of compounding, which is the architecture of the person you are fundamentally becoming. We have arrived at the ultimate destination of the compounding process. When you combine the trajectory of your money, the accumulation of your skills, the silent ledger of your reputation, and the physical reality of your daily habits, you are left with something far more profound than a simple list of achievements. You are left with the fundamental architecture of your identity. You are left with the person you have become. There is a natural tendency in human psychology to view our identity as something fixed, as if we are born with a specific personality and a predetermined destiny that we simply have to accept. We tell ourselves stories to justify our current circumstances. We say, I am just not good with money, or I am naturally an anxious person, or I am just not the kind of person who gets lucky in their career. We treat our identity as a static label. But the mathematical truth of your existence is entirely different. Your identity is not a permanent label assigned to you at birth. Your identity is a lagging indicator of your habits. It is the sum total of your compounded choices. You are literally building yourself brick by daily brick through the ordinary, unglamorous decisions you make on a random Tuesday afternoon. To understand how identity compounds, we must look closely at the difference between your intentions and your standards. Most ordinary people have wonderful intentions. They intend to get out of debt. They intend to learn a new skill. They intend to be more patient with their children, and they intend to finally get their health under control. But intentions do not compound. Intentions are just wishes floating in the air. The marketplace of reality does not care what you intend to do. What actually compounds are your standards. Your standard is not the goal you write down on January 1st. Your standard is the absolute minimum behavior you are willing to tolerate from yourself on a daily basis. If your standard is to blindly swipe a credit card for things you cannot afford, you will inevitably adopt the identity of a financial victim. If your standard is to give up the moment a task becomes intellectually difficult, you will permanently adopt the identity of someone who is left behind by the economy. When you drift through life, reacting passively to the demands of the modern world, you are allowing outside forces to dictate your standards. And when the world sets your standards for you, the negative compounding of your identity is swift and brutal. You slowly internalize the belief that you have absolutely no control over your environment. You embrace a mindset of chronic helplessness. You become someone who blames the government, your employer, or your upbringing for every single hardship you face. This victim identity is incredibly seductive because it absolves you of personal responsibility. It is much easier to believe the game is rigged than it is to admit you have been pushing your snowball in the wrong direction for a decade. But that mindset guarantees a lifetime of bitter, exhausted stagnation. Taking control of your life requires a quiet but radical act of rebellion. It requires you to grab the steering wheel and consciously dictate your own standards. You must refuse to wait for a miraculous lottery ticket or a sudden overnight transformation. You have to embrace the boring, beautiful, highly predictable math of doing the right things consistently. When you start saving just $50 a month to build a margin of safety, you are not just accumulating paper currency. You are fundamentally rewiring your identity. You are proving to yourself that you are someone who provides for their own future. When you spend 30 minutes reading a difficult book instead of scrolling through a digital feed, you are not just learning a fact. You are adopting the identity of someone who values their own mind. When you tell the absolute truth in a situation where a lie would have been easier, you are cementing the identity of a highly honorable person. Every time you take a positive action, no matter how small, you are casting a vote for the type of person you wish to become. In the short term, one single vote does not win the election. If you eat a healthy meal today, your identity does not instantly transform. But when you cast that vote thousands of times over a 5 or 10-year period, the compounding effect creates an absolute landslide. Your new identity becomes a permanent fortress. You no longer have to force yourself to be disciplined with money because you simply are not the type of person who wastes capital. You no longer have to force yourself to stay calm under pressure because you have become a person who naturally possesses an emotional moat. This is where the true power of time reveals itself. As human beings, we possess a massive flaw in how we calculate progress. We wildly overestimate what we can accomplish in a single day, and we tragically underestimate what we can accomplish in a decade. We try to overhaul our entire lives on a Monday, and when we inevitably fail by Thursday, we quit entirely. You do not need a massive, exhausting overhaul today. You do not need to work 14 hours a day, and you do not need to operate with a frantic, desperate intensity. The law of compounding does not require you to be a superhero. It only requires you to point your snowball in the right direction, give it a gentle push, and refuse to stand in its way. The hill of your life is long. The choices you make today are the foundation for the reality you will inhabit 10 years from now. You have the absolute power to decide what that reality looks like. Look carefully at the small, repetitive actions you are taking in your finances, your career, your relationships, and your health. Recognize that none of these actions are isolated events. They are seeds. If you plant the right seeds and you guard them with quiet, unshakable consistency, you do not need to worry about the future. The math of the universe will do the heavy lifting for you. Step out of the drift, set your standards, and let the gentle power of compounding guide you. Eventually, you will look around and realize that you have walked into a life of profound peace, genuine autonomy, and deep satisfaction, a life that you built with your own hands and a life you no longer want to escape from.